Okay, it is the top of the hour and we're going to get started. So an official welcome and hello everyone from wherever you're logging in from. Great to have you with us today as we talk about emotional intelligence and the bystander effect. Just before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement and just acknowledge that we are privileged to work and play on the traditional lands of the Wasanich people, and more specifically, the Sakem First Nation here in North Saanich, where we live. If you just want to take a moment to think about the traditional territories where you work and play, just to appreciate that we do have this land. All right, so we want to get started with our webinar, and just to let you know, I'm David Cory. For those of you who don't know me, you'll meet Jill momentarily, and we're with the Emotional Intelligence Training Company, or EITC, and we offer courses and programming on emotional intelligence, and we also offer coaching, and we have a group of people across the country, and we work with organizations of all sizes. So that's the extent of the sales portion of the webinar. Now we'll get on with our webinar.
Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This is a topic that has been emerging in different ways over a number of decades, with earlier research focusing on some of the outrageous social events that happen where many people watched somebody being hurt and didn't step in. And that was the beginning of this idea of the bystander and trying to understand the bystander effect. But in the last year and a half, as the Me Too movement, maybe last 2 years, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the confirming of the Indigenous children that have been murdered, it's brought about another level of understanding of the bystander effect, and that's what we're going to look at today. We want to look at how so many of those crimes, like so many of those crimes, other people knew about them and they stood by. They may have even aided the crimes. Think about some of the high-profile men in the US and some of the military men in Canada lately that have been called out on their sexual violence behavior. So they were not the only ones who knew the behavior. So we're really interested in looking at how people stand by and don't get involved, and how they may even become complicit in the crime by their silence or inaction. Not too long ago, an event happened that again highlighted the subtlety of bystander and the bystander effect. So I'm going to read you a little article that I started to write as I began to explore the meaning of it. So if you see a man hurting a woman, the question is, do you step in? Do you call out the injustice? Do you come to her aid? What about when a friend makes a negative racial comment? Do you challenge it, correct, or reframe it? As a society, we're coming to realize the importance of not being a bystander. It seems straightforward on the surface. Either we step in and help, or we stand by and feel justified because we're not directly involved. It's none of our business. Dave and I are arguing that it's more nuanced and complex than that. We're not the only ones making that argument, but thanks for joining us today to hear ours. I was recently having a conversation with a colleague who was visiting us in our home. He was sharing his interest in focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. He shared this perspective that people just want to connect as humans, and all this identity politics is divisive and unhelpful. He informed me that he has friends of color and that they just connect at a human level. He also explains that fundamentally, we're all humans who have more in common than we have differences, and that highlighting differences is not helpful. Yikes, I think. Is this a privileged perspective? Not everyone has the luxury or safety to think that our experiences and identities aren't relevant. Our histories of abuse, our skin color, our anatomy, our social location, our access to institutional power and money. We simply can't connect as humans, as one. He was a visitor in our home. He's a well-respected colleague in my field. And in that moment, he places me in the bystander dilemma, a dilemma with which he is unaware. That's power. I quickly weigh my options, remain politely silent, a good host, and implying agreement with the absurd claim that we are all just humans sharing humanity. Or I speak up. For those who know you, you know the outcome of this story. I speak up. I draw a breath and I carefully speak. I'm not sure that that is true, that we have more in common than differences. And then I draw on this ridiculous kind of lean on my academic background. So I say, I'm trained as a sociologist, trying to convince him that I have a credible perspective. We know that our social, emotional, relational, economic, and geographic locations shape our experiences and our opportunities. And these experiences privilege, suppress, or oppress our identities and our abilities to express ourselves as human beings. If we don't recognize these differences, we can't see people and affirm their lived experiences and realities. Huh, he says. But I digress from the bystander issue. I really want to speak to the dilemma and challenges that that moment put me in. I had a choice to respond in a personally, socially responsible way and remain true to my values, or be polite and let it go along with a peer culture that repeatedly and for decades has said, made the claim that we're all humans. And that narrative is completely controlled by white people and primarily white males. So my non-response would have implied agreement with perspective. And if I would have done that, I'd been a bystander, a silent, complicit bystander, affirming a white man's version of reality. It's not easy to speak truth to power, or even just disagree. We're well trained in our culture to be polite and go along with and conform. These assaults can be falsely seen as innocent or harmless comments. I mean, it's a nice idea that we're all humans and we connect at a human level. So why always be the troublemaker and point out the discrepancies or the problems of people's statements? Because they reinforce harmful stereotypes and they're a form of discrimination and reinforce inequities and inequalities. So that's what we want to talk about today, is like just having a deeper look at this idea of bystander. That's sort of what triggered this deeper dive into looking at it.
Oh, what I want to do here is we want to do a little quick poll here. So watch your screen where we'll share this poll for you. And if you could just take a look at the poll and choose one answer. A coworker makes a sexist comment in a team meeting. What do you do? Do you do nothing? Do you wait until after the meeting and speak with them privately? Do you address the sexist comment in the team meeting in front of them? Or do you trust that your leader will address it? Or is there some other response that you might have to that situation? And then please feel free to type it in the chat box. By the way, feel free to type anything into the chat box at any time. We want your comments, we want your questions. We want this to be a little bit more interactive as much as possible in a virtual environment. And thank you so much for your responses so far. Once most people are finished typing in their responses, then I'll share the results with you. Okay, so no one has said do nothing so far.
There's a lot of peer pressure in a bystander environment to not check off that box.
All right, so almost everyone has responded so far. So I'm going to end the poll there, and we're going to take a look at those results. So let's take a look. What we've got here is we've got 41% saying wait until after the meeting, speak with them privately. We've got 41%. Oh, it's a tie. Address the sexist comment in the team meeting in front of the team, and 12% trust the leader will address it. Someone types in, may depend on the context of the meeting, whether to address at the meeting or privately. Sure. I mean, there's lots of it depends, right? What exactly was the comment and how damaging and those sorts of things. There's a suggestion to use humor to address it in front of others. My level of sarcasm depends on who's in the room. Good one, Tammy. The goal is to educate and not embarrass. That's a great point,
Yeah,
Carrie. We're actually going to pick up
yeah,
on that point a little bit later
yeah,
on.
yeah,
All right. Thanks, everyone.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
The goal is really to educate here. Exactly.
What we're going to cover today quite generally is what we mean by bystander effect. So where did it come from? How has it maybe morphed over time? Because we think it has, and we'll tell you about that. Then we'll talk about EQ, or emotional intelligence. What does emotional intelligence have to do with the bystander effect, and how do we see those relationships? And then we're going to talk about some potential for the way forward, and then of course we'll have more questions from you. But again, if you have questions at any time, please feel free to just type them straight into the chat box.
Mhm.
In terms of what we're faced with when we have a situation where we are put into a bystander position, it's almost like we have these two choices. And it seems on the surface that it's a straightforward binary. Either we step in, we speak up, we do something, we take action, we help, or we stand by and feel justified because it didn't happen directly to us, and we're not directly involved. We're present, we're witnesses, but it's easy for us to say, well, it's not my business, and so we become silent bystanders. But of course, it's more complex and nuanced than that, and that's really what we want to explore today.
Mhm. I think one of the other binaries that we can think of is that we're not always the bystander or the caller outer. Sometimes we're actually the perpetrator. And I think some of us can think of times that we've done something that in retrospect was bullying or needed some addressing. So we can be on both sides of the coin as well. So the binaries are more complicated and revolving and moving. So I want to pay attention to both sides of our own responsibilities here. So as I said earlier, we're in this moment of cultural shift, thanks to the unfortunate and tragic events over the last couple of years that have come to light. And social media has played an important role in bringing much more to light and exposing much more and calling for more accountability. So there are sometimes that social media can be part of the problem, but it's also being a significant aid in bringing forward what has remained largely invisible to society in general over the last number of decades as a lot of this was occurring. So it's helping to give both awareness and a voice to the emergence of both the crimes and the bystander effect. Because we can think of in each of these cases, the Canadian military, that these men were not acting alone, that they had in their service people organizing and moving pieces around to protect them from exposure.
Yeah, and as Jill mentioned, with the Me Too movement, we learned about the enablers, the executive assistants, and the people who sort of arranged these meetings and covered up the activities that were going on. And with the murder of George Floyd, kind of really was a lightning rod for being more, having more protests, and we saw a huge reaction, almost like it stirred up the indignation of the populace. So while these things have been going on for decades, it just seems like it's different now. It seems like a different level of awareness, a new level of awareness, and then of course the confirmation of the Indigenous children's grave sites, there were people who knew that those things were happening. There were people in those schools who knew and who were bystanders. And then with the Canadian military, there are all these, all of this is coming to light now, but there were people who knew about that too. Some of these things happened on ships. Ships are tiny places. People had to know, and they were bystanders and complicit in those crimes. Ready to move on, Jill, from the slide? Okay.
So again, as we pointed to earlier, the earlier research really focused on one test case in particular. I can't remember her name now, Dave. The woman that was murdered in front of about 38 people.
Katie Genovese.
Yeah. And that prompted, from a psychological and a sociological perspective, a lot of investigation about the behavior of people watching. And so for a long time, the bystander has been that. Do we watch a crime in action or do we step in? But now, as we're shifting this focus, and it doesn't exclude that more public domain event, but it's pushing us more towards looking at how the old boys network operates, how the military operates, protecting their own, investigating their own crimes, how sports culture has silenced many misogynist, patriarchal ideas, how Hollywood, and we've again seen all of this, how the police protect their own religious institutions are untouchable by state, political institutions that are above the law. So what's so interesting for us is the dilemma that bystanders are put in, because you think of political institutions, a lot of people are employed. If they're whistleblowers, they know they're going to lose their job. So there's always a risk in being a bystander. And yet that's the weightiness of it, and that's the nuance of it, that it's not straightforward. You see a problem, you step in and help. And so they may not really want to be taking care of their own or hiding the problem. And they're in a moral dilemma because they're caught between power and their own self-protection sometimes.
Yeah, and interesting, with respect to the military and the police, and know wonderful colleagues who are working on these issues within the military and within the police and the RCMP, and we also know, and we've heard the stories of the deep traditions and that whole idea of membership. They refer in the RCMP and in policing, you may know, they refer to each other as members. They belong to a tight knit group, and they take care of their own. And so this again just really creates that kind of pressure against people becoming involved as bystanders, and that tremendous peer pressure to just be quiet and not say anything, even though you know it's wrong, you know it's morally wrong, and it may conflict with your own values. You don't speak up for risk of damaging your membership in that group.
Sometimes the peer group is referred to as peer culture. And again, we can look at university settings where, like in residences, where things happen in the kind of peer culture. And the peer culture has a set of rules that supersedes kind of everyday expectations or legal rules or social norms. And that peer culture, similar to sports or Hollywood, police, military, as Dave was suggesting, is very powerful. And those peer cultures also operate at work, but there are, we sometimes call them toxic work environments or healthy work environments, but those are peer cultures to which we're looking to our peers for information about how to behave and what's acceptable and not acceptable. And it's very difficult to step outside the norms and structure of those peer cultures without fear of punishment either social punishment or other forms of losses. So what supports these peer cultures? Underneath it are still these operating, deeply held, invisible, very often invisible oppressions. So systemic and cultural beliefs, patriarchy and misogyny, what we've seen in the last number of years around sexual violence and trafficking of girls and women cannot happen without an infrastructure of patriarchy and the hatred of women. Racism cannot happen in the police force against systematically oppressing and harming and killing people of color, particularly Black people of color. Our Indigenous people, in particular Indigenous children, cannot be murdered if you don't have a racist lens of an intention of genocide, eradicating a culture. Similarly with homophobia, transphobia, and classism, none of these crimes exist without these deeply entrenched entitlements. And that sets the peer culture and the norm for how we should all behave and what's acceptable and not acceptable. And so as we look in at some of those crimes, we think, how could they have gone along with it? Partly how they go along with it is they also hold, as we all have been trained to, hold these deeply held beliefs about white male privilege, heterosexual privilege, class privilege, and those are taken for granted and accepted kind of entitlements in the world. And so bystanders often aren't even troubled by what's happening because they align with their own deeply held beliefs or values, which makes the whole bystander problem so complex. If they don't even see the problem because they're swimming in the waters of patriarchy or racism, that's how deeply beliefs work. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. And just around patriarchy, one of the problems with patriarchy, if it was just men who believed in the patriarchy, who believed they should be central, superior, and deserving, then it might have a chance of going away. But we've got women who also support those patriarchal beliefs and believe in the superiority and centrality of men. And so, so when we adopt these beliefs and they are unexamined and they are hidden and they are beneath the surface and they're just taken as the way things are, that's when things get really dangerous. That's how Hitler was able to begin his genocide. It was a systematic and strategic propaganda machine to get people to believe what he believed in order to go along with and be bystanders to the terrible atrocities that he was responsible for. So we're really wanting to sort of examine some of these things and bring some of these things to light and become more conscious and aware of these again deeply entrenched entitlements. We entitle particularly white men, and we have a really interesting diagram which kind of looks at level of privilege, which we're going to show you momentarily. Oh, there it is. Do you want to speak to it, Jill?
It's like we planned it. So it's complex, and we're actually going to have a webinar on intersectionality, but we wanted to just introduce you to this brilliant model, and it really shows how people get privilege in different aspects of their identities. And so multiple identities are operating at the same time. So education, skin color, citizenship, whether you're a refugee or an immigrant or born in a country, your language of choice or home language, your mental health, your financial security, your housing situation, your sexual identity, your physical abilities, all of those are on continuums. And at the center of it is the most power. So when you have the most of it, you have the most power, and then it diffuses out to the margins. And that circle to me is representative of people living on the margins. The further away they are in each of those identities from the center of power, the more marginalized and vulnerable they are. And those with power have two ways of expressing it. They have power that is enabling and leading and supporting people and opening doors for people and essentially using their power for good, not evil. And then there's power that is about abuse and using it at any cost to anybody. So power is not in and of itself the problem, but power, the unintentional, the intentional use of it, or the unintentional lack of awareness, like my friend who was using his power to create a platform where he could have been sharing a message that was very strong and opening doors for people. And rather he was closing the door and, as Dave said, sort of mansplaining to me about diversity, inclusion, and equity, which was kind of naive on his part, believing he should have known who he was speaking to. So power in itself is not the problem, but power, the use of power for good or evil, is really what's helpful here about this drawing. And so it allows for us to think about the fluidity of our own responsibility to power and where we are, where we can use it, where we can open doors for others. And that's highly correlated with the phenomenon of bystander. Who uses their power for what purpose? And again, there's different power in each of those identities.
And I think, Jill, it's fair to say that a lack of awareness of this wheel is why people can say, "I don't see color,"
right?
Or
right.
I'm not prejudiced. It's a lack of understanding that we've been socialized to see color. We've been socialized to be biased, prejudiced, it is a hierarchy with old white men like me at the top. Whether we want to be there or not, and it's not about it's not about whether we use our power or not, it just is. And it's going to take a lot to undo that, to kind of, break down this hierarchy of power and privilege that we've all been socialized into.
And so, sorry, Dave, if we just go back, I just want to make sure we covered everything there. It's such an interesting wheel. But I think we're talking about the inhibiting influence of the presence of others, right? So the more power somebody has, the more it can silence somebody else who might want to be speaking up, but there are too many risks embedded in speaking up as well. And so again, without looking at these multiple identities, we can't really understand all the imperatives that a bystander feels when they're trying to make the decision about to speak or not to speak, to call it out, to invite people in, to educate them, however, whatever the process is around naming the offense, depends in large part on this wheel in combination, we are arguing, with some emotional intelligence skills. And then there are these other kind of cultural beliefs that support bystander inaction. Do you want to take those on, Dave?
Sure. Yeah, I think we've spoken to taking care of your own, right? This is the attitude of the military, and isn't it interesting that the military do their own investigations? They have their own court. They prosecute their own people for committing offenses. When something happens with the police, there's a policing incident, it's the police that investigate. It's internal affairs. They take care of their own, and as long as that's the case, then that supports bystander inaction. This whole idea of minding your own business, and it occurred to me as Jill and I were looking at this information that there's a bit of a there's a lot of a gender component. And the gender component for me is this idea of every man for himself and mind your own business. So it's kind of like, as a man, I was socialized to mind my own business. To, if something's going on, if some other guy is doing something, then I should just mind my own business, and that guy is responsible for what he does, and I'm responsible for what I do, and so I'm not going to get mixed up in his business. So that holds me back from being a bystander who takes action to some extent, and so I think that's interesting to notice, and it's there. And the idea that someone else will speak up. This is from some of the research that was done originally around this murder that happened, and one of the things that they observed was the idea that everybody thought that someone else was going to speak up, and so nobody did. So it leads to the idea that the more people are present to witness a public offense of some kind, that perhaps it's less likely that people will actually speak up and get involved. And they've done some other research which shows that that's not necessarily the case, that sometimes the more people are there, the more likelihood that someone will have the ability to actually intervene and do something. So a lot of interesting research in the area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a comment here that police do have outside investigators, and that is true, and it's becoming more true. There's certainly more call for that. I think what we're talking about are the lower level, less egregious kind of misuses of power that never go beyond the wall of the police or the RCMP or the military. So it is good that there's outside investigators, but the culture, the peer culture itself, calls for people to be bystanders, to support and be silent on the mistreatment of people of color, the mistreatment of women experiencing abuse, etc. So I think there's some of each, and certainly these outside bodies hold some hope as not being the bystander anymore. Another comment?
Someone is
okay. Yeah.
Someone is mentioning that they have to go, and yes, you'll all get a link to the recording. Absolutely. Some cultures condition you to not speak up. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Right. There is that country culture or regional culture component. Absolutely.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, and Stephanie,
don't be a bystander here.
As a neighbor of ours, Stephanie, and knowing the local police service, they are some of the most progressive in terms of police departments that we've seen in our work with police departments all over the country. So glad to hear that they've got outside, and it doesn't surprise me that they have outside investigators, unlike other.
We're confused on the comments about internal investigations. HR investigate that they follow good unbiased process. I'm not sure that's entirely true, Tammy. I think the way that biases show up at work are often so taken for granted that they don't even become a problem. Otherwise, we wouldn't have women coming forward 10, 20, 30, 2 years after the offense. Yeah, and again, this is not about critiquing police or military or HR or any of the things. It's about uncovering how often, even in that subtle way of having a visitor in our home, how often we get called on to either go along with the peer culture and our own beliefs about, being polite, or kind of taking that socially responsible stand and calling it out. And the premise here is so, in some ways, there's so much evidence to show that we have not been good citizens as a country and in North America, that we've allowed far too many kinds of crimes to occur in far too many populations of people who are vulnerable. And that includes within workplaces. That's why we have toxic work environments and why we have healthy work environments. Often that's about the willingness to speak up, and we've recently done something on psychological safety. So what we're uncovering here is really what is at play when a bystander is bystanding, and what does it take to step out of that and give voice and awareness to the problem. So
And we
Yeah,
should we should also mention, Jill, that really, a lot of what we're talking about happened a couple of decades ago, and it's probably better now, but we're dealing with what happened a couple of decades ago, and we're just sort of becoming aware and learning about the importance of not being a bystander now, seeing what happened a couple of decades ago, and knowing what those cultures were.
yeah, and I'd be a bystander if I didn't say that it's still going on, and we know it's still going on, and we know that rates of violence against women in relationships is going up. We know the police stand by on those very often. We know the court systems, um, almost 100% of the time, privilege men over women in those legal battles where women have experienced abuse. So we know that those inequalities continue to exist, and that there are institutional support and peer membership support for that. So it's complicated, and yeah, thanks, Tammy. Getting the investigation in the first place can be an issue because it requires somebody to say something happened, and that's about truth to power and the risk in that. And it also requires others around them saying, well, she's not going to take action and it happened to her, so I'm not going to do anything. So there are many binds that the bystander is put in. Yeah. And that not wanting to be seen as a troublemaker or making waves, people feeling that they're not equipped to handle it. There's lots of reasons to not step in. And the slide before is the suggestion that they don't step in because it's normalized. When the abnormal becomes normal, patriarchy has become normal. Privileging men over women is normal. That structure is so invisible, we don't even know it's operating most of the time. So that's why we're trying to uncover some of these institutional practices first, because that's the first thing that gets in the way, that white people are superior to people of color, that citizens of Canada are superior to immigrants and refugees, and that we are somehow entitled to more. Those are all aspects of what we have been led to believe, and takes responsibility off of us to speak up for those who are more vulnerable or being affected. And we have to know those structures before we can really be effective.
And yet more beliefs.
Which
Yeah,
I think,
the more we thought about this, the more beliefs came to mind. For example, the belief in politeness, maintaining the relationship at any cost, avoiding conflict, and just not wanting to muddy the waters, right? It's like, let's just maintain the status quo here. Let's not get anybody in trouble. Let's just, it's just easier to let things go.
I worked in a healthcare environment for 20 years, and when I would teach in the area of violence against women, and the focus was on patients, most nurses would say, well, that's every doctor that I've worked with. And of course, that's not true either. But what they're pointing to are those power dynamics that are so taken for granted in work environments that we don't even call them bullying. We just call them relationships. And we've been taught to expect those things. So again, when you swim in the water of whatever the problem is, it's hard to see the problem.
And this idea that personal protection and comfort matter more than social responsibility. Yeah, I just think that's so common and fairly typical, and it's just makes it easier to choose comfort over courage, which of course we were trying to encourage people to not choose comfort over courage, and I just really like this image that I found, which is of course this idea that comfort feels good, but courage contributes to greatness, which I think is a really great saying. Just looking at the chat box. Jill, are you looking at the chat box too? Yeah. Andrea says, I often did not step in because of continuing to carry shame from being marginalized. Absolutely. While I was living with that, the fear of being further othered was too terrifying. Absolutely. The loss of belonging and social capital is so painful. Absolutely, Andrea. And yeah, I mean, we just, We just know that's the case, and for many people. And why would you draw further attention to yourself? You already don't have the comfort to choose. You're already uncomfortable. Why would you choose more discomfort or more
Risk,
yeah,
lots
risk?
of times risk.
Absolutely,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Which is
thanks
why
for
the
that, Andrea.
closer to the center of power, the more responsibility we have, in a way, to use that to name. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Andrea.
There's the Donald. He just seemed to fit for this slide.
Yeah, and so again, pointing to this idea that when people have power, it's harder to challenge them. And so sometimes it takes power to challenge power, or it just takes a tremendous amount of courage because it's like there doesn't seem like any other way out except just to tell the truth. So these are just questions that we invite you to consider. Are certain identities and voices more normalized or valued than others in your work setting?
Mm-hmm.
And how do your identities shape your interactions with others? And how might you consciously or unconsciously be complicit with an offender? That means a boss who's a bully, a colleague who's racist. Like how do we, unconsciously or consciously become part of the problem? And this, again, closer to the center, you either can have opportunity to make more changes, or it can be a license to say whatever you want, leaving the rest of the world to decide whether to be a bystander and respond to it or not.
Yeah.
And then to
Yeah.
Andrea's point, and then somebody using their power to again marginalize you further, or open the door. That's what power can do.
Yeah, and Angela contributes. It begs the question of trust as well in these environments. Absolutely, Angela. That base of Patrick Lencioni's pyramid in the 5 dysfunctions of a team, the absence of trust. Absolutely. When there's no trust, yeah, I mean, all kinds of bad things happen, including contributing to silent bystanders.
Yeah. And so that the title, the posturing and pontificating, that was the moment that when he was speaking, I was like, this is just posturing and pontificating. And he's so used to doing that everywhere and having people around listen and be, seem as respected. And it's like, nobody's ever called him on his bullshit, right? Like, how does that happen for 40 years in business? That nobody's ever said, yeah, that's not true. You're not right. So that's all right. That's enough of I'll stop posturing.
Enough pontificating?
Yeah.
Tammy writes, organizations struggle with he said, she said, especially when witnesses aren't comfortable sharing the whole truth.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Tammy.
Yeah.
And once again, we know some wonderful people who are working on these issues with the military, and they are dealing with those he said, she said situations all the time. And they are I think doing the best job they can under the circumstances, again, of trying to fix something that was created by what we're talking about, by these deeply held beliefs, and this enablement, and this power, this abuse of power.
Hey, did we take out the microaggression slide?
No, it's coming up.
Okay, I think that's helpful. Maybe we'll come back to the engaged bystander.
There it is. Sorry,
oh,
I missed it.
How did we miss that?
I don't know.
Because this is the other side of, there are these egregious offenses, but then there are these what we've come to in the literature call microaggressions that are no big deal. And first, I'd like to encourage people to not call them microaggressions, but let's just call it aggression, repeated aggressions or repeated abuses. And this is the other thing, I think, to Tammy's point, when it's a he said, she said, it's about lifting the system of power to visibility, so that these things aren't about who said what, but it's about really everybody understanding more deeply what is okay and not okay as in organizational behavior. Want to say more there?
Sure, absolutely, and we wanted to include this because we were thinking, okay, so we're kind of over focused on the big events, the either the public, the the public insults or the blatant sort of offenses, but then there's all these other more subtle things that we let slide. So they go on in team meetings and staff meetings and conversations among work colleagues, but people don't speak up or call out. And we're gonna again speak to that idea of calling out, because we rather like the idea of calling in people on these kinds of subtle aggressions towards others. And so we wanted to make sure that we mentioned it and make sure that we labeled it and identified this idea of the cumulative effect of microaggressions. You can see the physicians there at the bottom of the slide, and those microaggressions that they experience regularly. And I couldn't believe it when we had a South Asian physician commenting on the COVID crisis, and then there were all these comments about the fact was like, couldn't they find a Canadian doctor to do that commentary? It was ridiculous, the level of ignorance and the number of outright aggressions that guy, and they interviewed him later about it, who he deals with it every day. And wow, just the far way we have to go to reduce the kind of microaggressions towards people.
Right.
Yes,
And again, you can see
absolutely, Tammy,
how,
about the impact. Yeah.
yeah, you can see how linked this is to these larger structural problems. So they get enacted in these smaller assaults, but they are connected to systemic racism, to systemic patriarchy, etc. So that's this connection between the micro level, but they are not small aggressions. They are significant because of the cumulative impact. Yeah.
Yeah, the name is misleading.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we want to move from the silent bystander to the engaged bystander. So what is an engaged bystander? Well, first of all, an engaged bystander, someone who chooses courage over comfort, and they actually speak up and they confront, but also um, someone who is an ally. And you've probably heard a lot about allyship and being an ally. And there are ways to be an ally that are supportive and helpful, and there are ways of being that people think are they're being a helpful ally, which are actually not that helpful.
I think a lot of these we've talked about naming and dismantling, but to me, this never gets old because it's so persistent, and these like patriarchy and racism have existed for so many decades. They're pretty entrenched, and it's going to take a lot of naming and calling that and giving voice to it for those to change. And the inequities, I think it continues to be all of our responsibility to name inequities and to give vulnerable populations and those at the margins room to access the center, which means speaking up, educating, advocating, sometimes calling out, sometimes calling in. And so again, being polite Canadians, we're always leaning towards the calling in, but sometimes it just requires more emphatic voices to say that's not okay. And then we've talked about using our own positions to create platforms for other voices. And I think this is such an important one: listen, support, and learn. I felt like, again, my colleague was not in a position to listen, support, and learn because he's so used to pontificating and being right. And I think we all have to ask ourselves, where do we need to sit back and really just accept that we know so little about other people's experiences, and that our own beliefs make us kind of trick us into thinking that they're everybody's beliefs or capacities or lifestyles.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So Nigel has contributed. My Grandmother's Hands is a great book. So he contributed that a while back, and so thank you for that, Nigel. And now another resource. He's got the link
Yeah, the
to the
allyship.
General
Yeah,
Mills allyship resources. Thank you, Nigel. And Angela points out, would this be about leveraging your independence competency? And absolutely, Angela. And so,
yeah,
so we're working up to that. I just want to let you know that I chose this image, not that you should be hugging everybody in the workplace, because you have to be careful about that, but this notion that we have each other's backs, that we're there for each other, that if your team is a true team, you speak up, you stand up, you aren't a silent bystander. And what a way to demonstrate that you care about people, that you're there for people, what a way to build trust as a leader. And again, one of the comments that I made, I think it may be in the description, is that being a bystander is almost like the opposite of being a leader. Leaders are engaged bystanders. If something's going on, they're speaking up about it. They are standing up and they are saying what needs to be said and doing what needs to be done. All right, so this next one is to speak up or not speak up, choosing courage over comfort. Have we said all these things
yeah,
in
yeah,
different ways, Jill, so
yeah.
far?
Right thing in the right way.
Okay,
Yeah. So each
yeah,
you can help.
yeah.
Yeah,
Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same. I love that when I saw it.
yeah,
So many of you know the model, and this is the basis for the emotional quotient inventory. And it is about the notion that if we are to be intelligent about emotions, this sort of emotional social life that we humans live, it's about skill development. How are we going to develop our emotional skills? And we've got 15 of them, and you can sort of study. We've got lots of resources on our website about the model if it's a model that you're not familiar with. But I just wanted to point out some of the skills that we think are going to be really important in moving from the silent bystander to the engaged bystander. And so here's that list. And of course, they're all important ultimately to being an engaged bystander, but we wanted to single out a few of them.
so self-regard we always place really at the center of everything, and that means that you have a pretty clear idea and a sense of yourself and a sense that it's stable over time. So you can hold your own and you know what you're holding when you stand up to somebody. Um, People who might call themselves like people pleasers, for example, hate that term, but we all understand what it means, are probably less likely to call out or speak to something that they disagree with. So knowing who you are and being prepared to speak is really important. And that goes along with emotional self-awareness. Like what are the cues in your body and in your emotions that are telling you that someone's stepping on something here for me and this is not okay. So both of those are really important. And assertiveness is about not aggression, but assertiveness, being prepared to speak up, being clear and respectful and describing the impact that it's having and saying what's not okay about that statement. And carry on, Dave.
Sure. Tammy just says, what about emotional expression? She didn't see it on the list. And we debated over whether to include it.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right, Tammy.
Yeah.
I mean, we could make the argument that all 15 competencies are critical and important here. And yes, emotional expression is saying how you feel. If you are, and it's part of our assertiveness model that we teach people is starting with I feel. And so that emotional self-awareness, emotional expression is critical and important here. And knowing your values and knowing when your values are being contradicted or in conflict. Where did you get down to, Jill?
Well, independence, and that's what Angela was pointing to, that
Yes,
this idea of not being
yes.
influenced by the group norms, that you
Yeah.
have an independent ability to think and have critical thinking and make a conscious choice about your own beliefs and what's okay, again, what's not okay and feeling like you'll speak up even if it's not the popular thing to do or acceptable even.
Yeah, and it's sort of knowing and understanding that we're all influenced by peer pressure. It's why we dress the way we do, drive the car we drive, etc. But it's knowing when when you have to go against that peer pressure, when you have to take independent action and speak up about something that's not right. Empathy, social responsibility. When we have this other focus, it makes it much more imperative that we speak up, that we take action, that we engage in that situation. And interpersonal relationships, we were thinking about this certainly in terms of the person who is the victim of the abuse, or the person who is aggrieved, but also the people who are committing the offense. And this is the calling people in versus calling people out approach that has been referred to, and this idea that we don't need to shame people. And Brene Brown's very clear: nothing good ever came from shaming someone. So we want to be able to educate and provide information in a way that, again, doesn't put people down or shame them, but is simply inviting them to be more informed about issues, etc.
I think one of the things that's triggering for me, Dave, is and don't forget about the person who was impacted by it, right? Like sometimes we're so careful to protect the offender that we forget about the person who was most impacted by it. So those interpersonal relationships, and you pointed to that, the first one is really the person who's been impacted. And sometimes we need to take the lead from them in terms of what else we do and what our responsibilities might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and finally, problem solving. And those of you who know the model know that problem solving is about being aware of and understanding the emotions in a situation and being able to do what you need to do despite. And so thinking clearly, using your logic and reason in that situation, and not be so clouded or flooded by other emotions that it causes you to do something that might not be the right move in that situation, might put yourself at greater risk or danger even. And so we need to have that ability to think clearly in that situation.
And my version of that's quite different. So there's the gender difference. Mine is pay close attention to your emotions, because they're going to guide you in a really good way. They're going to tell you what's happening and what's calling on you to respond to, and that will help you in your problem solving when you pay attention to the emotional
Sure,
side
but
as
Jill,
well.
Jill, that's not helpful if you're frozen. If you're
Yeah,
frozen on the spot, that doesn't help you. So
no,
yes, and
yeah,
that's what we would say.
that's what we would say.
Okay, so we're coming up to the end of our time. We don't like to go over time. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Some great perspectives here. Thank you, Nigel. Once again, we'll take a look at all the resources that you're pointing out to us. And if you have any questions, please type those into the chat box, and we'll take those questions now. What we would like to offer you is the opportunity, if you want the slides. We won't necessarily make the slides available to everyone, but if you want the slides, take your phone out, simply text the word EITC to 66866, and we'll send you a PDF of the slides to whatever email address you enter in after that. But text EITC to 66866 for the slides. Any questions that anyone has? I don't see any questions. Jill, is there anything that you wanted to add or say by way of wrapping up?
No.
Thanks everyone for being here. We really appreciate your participation and your great comments. So there's another one from Tammy. Where are you from? Great example of microaggressions. Yeah, there's lots of great resources and great stuff. Angela asked, what's the number to text to get the slides? Text the word EITC to 66866.
It's on the slide here as well.
It's on the final slide if you've got your screen open and you're looking at your screen. All right.
Yeah, and you're right. Anne says, thanks for tackling this challenging issue. And I think we just want to continue to reiterate, these are meant to be exploratory. We're not positioning ourselves as experts on it, and it helps us to think about it when we're presenting to you, and your comments help to deepen our thinking. And that's part of what we're trying to develop at EITC, is a thoughtful and critical community thinkers and actors. So thank you all for helping us to think more about this as well.
Thanks, everybody. It's been great. Really enjoyed this, and hope to see you on future webinars. Bye for now.
Bye for now.